1931 is actually a very important date in the history of recording technology and Maltese music. 1931 was the year where EMI, or HMV, became EMI, Electrical Manufacturing Industries. It was also the year in which the first records of Maltese music were produced. It is also the starting point of the Malta's Lost Voices project, which in the past decade has become known for the digitization and preservation of Maltese songs on the earliest records of Maltese music, now known as the Malta's Lost Voices project. My interest in music and records led me to carry out personal research into the story of Maltese music. Looking for the earliest recordings led me to a very particular collection of songs which were published in the early years of the interwar period. I'm talking about 1931 and 32, when in those days you had the Valletta agents, the music shops, which would contract musicians of a variety of styles, and generally rehearse them and package them and prepare them for recording sessions overseas. It's very interesting to think about this recording technology and the recording phenomenon, not only in Malta, but also internationally. You see, by the early 20th century, most of the record companies were already sending recording engineers to pretty much every corner of the globe to contract musicians and document their music. This was not necessarily out of artistic scope, but more out of an economic. The impetus was actually driven by an economic desire to make records to sell gramophones worldwide. Therefore, you have the interaction of technology, of people with technology in recording technology, as from the early 20th century, where the desire was to sell software, to sell the hardware. Interestingly enough, Malta was also ripe in those days. The phenomenon of recording Maltese music happened in the early 30s, which was quite late. However, by that time you had new technology which made this possible and made both the gramophones themselves more economically viable and available to a larger section of the population, as well as the records having developed technologically to produce a high fidelity sound which was pleasurable, at least coming through the gramophone horn. It was very interesting for me to discover this phenomenon of Maltese music, particularly through references in the journals of the day. By going through the microfilms at the Biblioteca in Valletta, I discovered many references to the publication of these records, adverts which would give the listings of records which were published month after month, as well as references to musicians and composers and music agents who were responsible for this musical phenomenon, which became a social phenomenon. You have to understand that in those days, the Maltese had listened to music from Italy. They were exposed to records of Italian music, of American music and English music, but this was the first time that the Maltese heard their own voice and their own language coming out of the gramophone horn. So it was a very interesting self-reflexive exercise. Plus, it was not necessarily appreciated by all strata of society, as the midday views indicate that the quality or the content of some of these records was actually spurned. It also led me to discover communities in Valletta, the types of, the likes of Fortunato Habib was a person I discovered, a merchant from Valletta. I discovered his shop through the Guida Generale, which makes reference to his shop Lisette in Merchant Street, originally called Lafayette. He was a merchant of Italian origin, of Jewish descent, who sent the first group of musicians to Tunis in 1932 to record the first 15 records on Polyphone Records. Interestingly, due to the lack of commercial studios here in Malta, musicians would be sent overseas to record with electrical recording methods on labels like Polyphone, Audion, Zonophone, and His Master's Voice. In Tunisia, Polyphone and Audion were prevalent, and the first 15 records of Maltese music were published in Valletta in February to April of 1931. The first 15 records interestingly portray the music and styles which were prevalent in the day, the kind of music that people would listen to, which was lyrical music, operatic music, but also comic storytelling and traditional ana. The 5 musicians who took off on that ship in November 1930 were actually none other than Giuseppe Schwirp, known as a Shudi, who was known for his ana, Manuel Mercia Simensa, Wati Kakia, who was a well-known baritone, and the tenor Antonio Toma Castelletti. These were accompanied by the musician Giuseppe Prato, who was a well-known and accomplished musician who played double bass, piano, and guitar, as well as sang. The 5 people came back with 15 records on Polyphone label in 1931. The newspapers of the day publicized the arrival of these records as being quite a social phenomenon. While some criticized the content and the quality of the records, it was also lauded by others who thought that this was definitely a commendable exercise and it should be repeated. Interestingly, later that year, we also find that other agents from the music shops in Valletta started and caught on to the exercise of recording Maltese music. It's very interesting that for the first time also you have to understand that Maltese music, like music elsewhere, had to be edited to 3 minutes. The technology of the day produced 10-inch records, which is about 32 centimeters, which means that for a disc spinning at 78 revolutions per minute, it would produce approximately 3 minutes of playing time. This interestingly became the standard of the pop song in later years and in later decades. Another interesting aspect about the 10-minute discs, the gramophone discs, disket al-faham, as they are referred to in Maltese, is the fact that the recordings on these records and practically all the music of the world was edited to 3 minutes to fit on these records. Classical records or classical music was sometimes recorded on 12-inch records, which gave them 4 minutes 20 seconds. However, Maltese ana and Maltese lyrical songs were from this point onwards composed and arranged to fit on 3-minute records. Another very interesting aspect of this technology is that there was no post-production, which means all the recordings on records worldwide until the 1950s were live studio productions. They're very interesting because it's almost like these records are sonic sculptures which encapsulate, like a snapshot, an oral snapshot of the studio with the musicians in that particular time and place in history, documenting Maltese musicians in Malta, Tunis, and elsewhere. By June of 1931, Nino D'Amato, who was known for his reputable store of D'Amato, which is known today as D'Amato Record Store, was already a reputable agent for His Master's Voice gramophones. He had already gone into a deal in the early 20th century with His Master's Voice. And now, in correspondence with the mother company, realized that it was a lucrative activity to embark on the recording of Maltese music. So he proceeded to engage composers, musicians and lyricists who would then produce between 1931 and 32 a set of 50 gramophone records under his master's voice record label, also under the Zonophone set of records. He proceeded to contract the well-known satirist and writer Carlo Satariano, who was known for his contribution in the popular journals of the day, Il Himar al-Ber'a, and Dr. Brombos, amongst others. These were very important reference in my research in terms of discovering not only the activity of recording and who took part, but also many of his lyrics were later published in the journals of the day and which became direct reference for my research. Amongst other people, I think one of the better-known characters was the personality Emanuele Cilia, who was a well-known folk singer from Hazebuch. Through my research in the correspondence between Anthony D'Amato, Nino D'Amato, and the mother company in Middlesex, UK, I discovered that the mother company agreed that it would be potentially lucrative to embark on the exercise of recording Maltese music, also because of the consideration of the Maltese diaspora, which existed elsewhere in Australia, Canada and the States. Even though Nino D'Amato would not have the rights as distributor in those countries, he could organize the packaging for the Maltese diaspora. So he saw the potential lucrative business of making and selling records. One condition by the mother company was that all the material on record would have to be of original nature, as the market being so small, it was not worth spending the money on copyrights and royalties. Therefore, all the material recorded on these Maltese records was produced specifically for the set of records, or at least would have to be of a public domain so as not to pay any royalties. Emanuele Cilia, the well-known Annei from Hazebuch, was contracted, in fact, for the singing of the Ana ballads, many of the lyrics penned by Carlo Satariano. Emanuele Cilia became known for many of the songs that he would record in those 2 years, and would eventually come back with 29 songs under his belt, many of which would make him very famous and many of which he would be remembered for. Even in his lifetime, it is said that as he walked through the village, people would play many songs like Shahna Zbih Minja Fiarana or Arturo Maria, which were attributed to Cilia. We also know that the musicians received a 5% royalty rate on the sale of records. They were not paid directly, but they were paid on the sale once the records were sold. We know for a fact that Carmelo Busuttil, Emanuele Cilia, Carlo Satariano, and all those people who were engaged for the production of the Maltese records would receive royalties for the rest of their life, actually, even until the 60s. Interestingly, later that year, or earlier that year, Louis Carabot from the Music Emporium in Merchant Street, also made arrangements to send musicians to Tunis to record under the Odeon record label. However, earlier that year, he was in agreement with the Deutsche Grammophon record company to bring the recording equipment and engineers to Malta. It is reported that Carlo Diacono, the well-known composer from Zeytun, in fact was contracted for the organization of the recording hall, finding a hall and soundproofing it here on Merchant Street in 1931. It is interesting to note that with the recording sessions happening in Malta, it was now possible to record more than 6 musicians. On the overseas trips, it was not possible to send many musicians and singers on a recording trip, and therefore the visiting party was always very limited. In this case, you had orchestras, you had choirs, singers of every genre, which were included in this hall and could produce their music. Another 48 records were produced under Odeon Records, this time with a large variety of songs. It was important to produce a catalogue which had a variety of musical styles, one which would appeal to the tastes of many people. So at the end of the day, you have a section with lyrical music, waltzes and tangos and foxtrots, and the musical which was danced to in the days in the music halls around Valletta. You also have an amount of storytelling known as macchietti, usually or parlanti, usually accompanied by music. And the third section would be the ana, or folk singing, the folk chant, which included lots of poetry and accompanied by guitars. It is interesting to know that 1932, another group of musicians was sent by D'Amato to the Milan studios, HMV studios in Milan, as the Maltese, Sicilians and Sardinians would be sent to record in Milan, going into Italy via Sicily and then catching a train up to Milan, where they would spend a week and record their music. Also, the records in Tunisia would be sold and distributed to the Maltese community, it was noted, as the Jewish merchants in Tunisia would sell the records for the enjoyment of the Maltese people. It is also reported that many of the folk singers did actually visit Tunisia on a number of occasions, including Giuseppe Sciuri for the entertainment of the Maltese. 1932 was actually the last of these recording sessions, where Louis Carabot would send the last visiting party to record on the Pathé, French Pathé records.
Maddalena, Maddalena, which the socra, which Elena, in a jet apostolic, fitte shohrot fan gaudi.
The reasons for the activity not being carried out through the war or after the war is as yet undiscovered. Research shows that in actual fact the records and the gramophones were not that cheap for society at the time, even though the popularity of the music definitely withstood the test of time, as these records later on in the 60s would get, well, at least a selection of these records was reproduced on 45 RPM vinyl records. This would at least guarantee the memory of these songs and this music and the musicians for definitely another generation. Many of these songs were played on the rediffusion in later years, and today we have access to these songs and these records. In fact, through the Malta's Lost Voices project, we have now digitized the entire collection. We have installed a database in the National Archives where the public can now reference the music and these songs, both for research purposes but also for entertainment. The content is now being made public through the publication of this music through books, CDs, LPs and other products under the record label Filfla Records, because we believe that it is very important that this material is made accessible in interesting but also in quality ways, so as to guarantee the posterity and the memory of this music. I think that one of the ways of guaranteeing the memory of this music and the songs and the stories of these people is by actually performing. And therefore we have only recently published a series of songbooks for education. And hopefully the memory of these songs and these records will not be forgotten and could be passed on through performance or even through publication, but also through the ongoing availability of the material which is available for research here in the library and elsewhere.
الدار وصل داخل جوا مياو سيح للماريا يكام ديكش بيشير بالجوفني ما العرفة دا يستأسيا واني طلبك لي تحفر لي عشان الزواج ما نستاش قلبي حبت لي الارتورة ويصبح منه ما نراش ذاك الانفامي تام السيرة كم كله قلبه حزينة للبنتو طيب ربطا عن الزيلة جول كانتينا